All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. This is the 2 p.m. meeting of the Finance and Government Operations Committee, and we will begin with item number 1, which is the call to order and a roll call to establish the presence of a quorum.
Supervisor Chavez. Here. Supervisor Smithson.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. A quorum having been established, we'll move to item number 2, which is public comment. Public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public on non-agendized items properly within the jurisdiction of our committee. I have 2 cards today, one from Susan Bassey and one from Scott Largent. Ms. Bassey, would you like to come up to the microphone and...
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Scott Largent. I had a wonderful visit yesterday. I had a really good visit. I wish I could put pictures up on here. You got to submit them early. But I did get to see my daughter yesterday, so she was very excited. I was dressed as Minnie, so we had a good 2-hour visit, and that was a very successful one. I'm getting back onto the how it's just really hard to understand any of this stuff out of our court system right here. My original order here provided me with 5 hours twice a week. So this was out the gates after 3 weeks. Now this stuff is very hard to understand. Law enforcement looks at it like it's in Mandarin. And this was another thing that was very hard to figure out. And I kept putting this in front of law enforcement. I said, look, hey, this says I can see my kid. Do something about it. You know what they say? Go back to court. Go back to court. Go back to court. I go, hey, I have an order. I want you guys to enforce it. So like we keep saying, there's no enforcement. One of the big things was that I kept bringing up in here was the firearms thing, so it sounds like we're getting on that, but what about the rest of the stuff that people don't understand? The worst part about this order was the language of the civil and peaceful contact thing, and that kept driving me absolutely nuts. I kept finding everything online that said what civil and peaceful contact is. Now, what would you all consider civil and peaceful contact? Brief contact, discussing your child. Is this a 5-minute meeting? Is it a 20-minute interaction? Why is this stuff so hard to understand? Because what our current legal system and family court wants you to do is they want you to look at this and say, I don't understand it. You get on the phone with your attorney. Well, I can't afford an attorney. Self-help doesn't understand any of this stuff. So what else do you do? I want it explained properly. I want to know, why is this stuff not being followed? So what did Scott do? He started attending every domestic violence council meeting. And I kept bringing this up. Can somebody explain this to me? Can somebody explain why law enforcement doesn't understand it? And they never could give me a solid answer. And what they ended up doing was making my life hell. They made me not feel comfortable at these meetings, and they put more pressure on me for challenging our courts. Well, I'm kind of going at this alone in there. Now, fortunately enough, Susan's been able to go to these meetings. We've been able to bring other domestic violence victims into these meetings. But why do they want to keep the public out so much? Why did they get so upset when I started filming these meetings? Because that's where you're able to pick up on all the flaws of the system. So what I've been doing now is I'm using my GoPro that I have, and I'm chopping up all the things that sound absolutely ridiculous from these domestic violence councils. And I'm also doing the same thing with how many times they didn't even make quorum. And it's funny because they start laughing in there like it's, oh, ho, ho, maybe we'll make quorum, ha, ha, ha. You know what I would do? I'd go in there and be like, you're all fired. You're off of my committee. Get out of here. You're a failure. These people shouldn't laugh at not being able to do the business of the Domestic Violence Council. So keep my fingers crossed it's going to get fixed. Thank you.
And Ms. Bassey.
First of all, I'd like to start off by thanking Colin for returning the media sign that disappeared after I took Mr. Rosen's picture. We've had a busy week this week. We started out on Tuesday. Mr. Largent and I came in when you were considering a pay increase for Mr. Rosen. And I was aware that you made 2 cracks at the apple trying to see if you could get that money. And I do feel sorry for the assessor. He probably deserved the money. And Jeff Rosen is probably responsible for him not getting it. Jeff Rosen hasn't done his job in this county. But what you don't know is that after I left that meeting, Mr. Largent and I tried to interview Mr. Rosen on several occasions, And we followed him from the meeting, as I have traditionally done, to talk about victims that he is failing to serve in our community. And Mr. Rosen, within an hour of that effort, sent a plea deal to my criminal lawyer offering that they would allow me to plea guilty to things that I didn't do if I agreed to stay away from the courthouses and if I agreed to destroy evidence of public corruption. Contained on this iPad is information of you violating the Open Government Act, violating the Brown Act, evidence of judge crime, and evidence of dark money in our divorce cases. I presented to you earlier this week an issue related to a list for privately compensated temporary judges. That is under California Rule of Court 2.834. That list has been concealed by the court staff. I have filed complaints with the county. I have filed public records requests, and I have gone to Lisa Herrick on numerous occasions. Lisa Herrick had the ability to call me up and ask for pictures that she found offensive on the internet to be removed related to an anonymous email or blog or something. Mrs. Herrick couldn't get back to me related to Court of Appeal fees, fee waivers, and other issues that the courts have been obstructing for over 2 years. The individuals in our courts are acting to obstruct justice. We have a monopoly on divorce cases. They're supposed to be courts of equity, and instead they're giant playgrounds that are absolutely disgusting and will make every person in this world not believe in our legal system because of what we're doing right here in Santa Clara County. I want to point out that in addition to the Rule 2.834, I finally got my list after 4 years. And on that list was the private judge assignment of Google. Today, Google employees are walking out all over the world for how they've been treated. The Google divorce came about after the founder of Google cheated on his wife and ended up in a divorce. They have 3 children, and they had a private judge. We don't know how much they were compensated and how much their divorce cost. They're worth over $50 billion. The rest of us weren't afforded that disclosure. No one knows how much my private judge was paid or that he was even on the list. You have a dark money problem, and you need to take care of it.
And our next speaker is Valerie Driscoll. Ms. Driscoll?
And to continue with what this good lady has been saying, there are problems. I met a woman who has sued the district attorney for $260,000 for things that have happened to her that they try to cover it up, as she's saying. They don't want to help people. If you land in a bad place to live, they would rather blame you for it. So I had to get in touch with the senior attorney over the defense and make certain that she got the expungement I needed because they accused me falsely and they also stole my phone. And the police, with the mayor understands the services don't get down to the people. This is part of the problem. And so in this day and age, it's about money. We get that. There's no DACA. We get that, and I understand why that is, and I agree. But what it is the top 1%, 4%, and 10%, as Elizabeth Warren has been saying throughout the Senate and Congress, is that these are the people who have the power. The people who are unfortunate, who don't find themselves in these upper income levels, are the ones that are the pawns of this unfortunate circumstance. I had to go and yell and scream to have somebody come down to help me to make certain they took care of this case correctly because I was accused falsely. And then this Law Foundation says I have 2 lawsuits. One is against the court with the attorney, Hultgren, for doing this and for doing harms and damages, grievances I'm summoning right now. And the second is with Momentum for not providing the services for psychologists, for damages, and for housing and these terrible things. But they don't see, too, the housing, nor do they affect laws, which they were talking about doing a fine for this independent living and these kind of people that don't look after their people, where they should charge them $520, $560 for causing these tenants to have to call to charge the county more money to hospitalize them and these sorts of nonsense issues. We need to also look seriously at rent reduction and rent control, which Gary Goodman over in his office, who is the supervisor to all of the defense attorneys, says that's an interesting topic and he agrees. That's why I told him I would mention it to Joe Simidian, okay, at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me check with the clerk of the board, make sure we have no other cards under item number 2, which is public comment. All right, if not, that takes us to item number 3, which is to approve changes, if any, to the committee's agenda. I'm not aware of a request for any changes to the committee's agenda. Supervisor Chavez, without objection, we will approve the agenda as published. Yes? Thank you. That takes us to our special agenda. For those of you who are regular attendees, you will know that this is one of our quarterly meetings where we take up issues of privacy and data security, and this is one of the 2 of the 4 meetings we do each year where we have a special meeting and don't put the item on our regular agenda. We stop and focus explicitly on this set of issues. So items 4, 5, and 6 all deal with privacy and data security issues in one way or another. And why don't we start with item number 4, since it is next on the agenda, and receive the report from the Office of the County Executive, the Chief Information Security Officer, the Chief Privacy Officer, and the Health and Hospital System Ethics, Privacy, and Compliance Officer, which must look great on your business card because that's a long title. Dr. Smith, to whom should I turn? Mr. Dietrich, are you the starting point in this conversation today?
Yes, I am. Justin Dietrich, Chief Information Security Officer.
Then go ahead and please begin.
All right. Providing an update on the information security program. I know the Register of Voters risk assessment has been a regular item on the FGOC meeting, but certainly needed to highlight it here as is certainly one of our major efforts. But aside from just bringing up that's one of our major efforts, and also to add that we've received just a phenomenal level of support from everybody in the county to help us ensure that the Register of Voters is as secure as possible. I don't have too much to add except for it is a significant amount of work effort, so that's one thing we have.
And thank you. And before you go on, I should just indicate, because I think you've been in touch with my office on this, and I'll look to Mr. Pascal from my office. We are planning after the election is complete and we've had the ability to take a little time to pull folks together in some sort of a conference setting and pull other folks in as well and ask, all right, so now what have we learned? What are our best practices? What should we be thinking about, looking forward to? Because you know, with an early primary, 2020 is not that far away. We're going to roll out of this November election and be less than a year and a half away from having a presidential election on our ballot in March of 2020. So I know you look forward to that opportunity, Mr. Dietrich, and we look forward to pulling you and your colleagues into the conversation, as well as folks from outside the area. Because as I say, we're going to have a very real need to address these issues almost, we'll give you a day or two to take a breather, but after that, we're going to need to be right back to them, okay? Thank you. With that, I promise I won't have an announcement like that for each slide. Go right ahead.
That'd be greatly appreciated. But yes, no, I totally agree. I mean, this is something that's going to be ongoing. When we complete our current phase of this process, you know, it's just going to be an ongoing process, so we totally understand that. All right, next slide. Just wanted to add that we are continuing to build our team up. We have a junior member, Vu Huang. He's just started recently and already integrating into the team. And we, as soon as we can get the position posted, we continue to be fully staffed for the security team, which is also, I think, an accomplishment just in the Bay Area and the high demand of security professionals. But yet we remain 100% staffed for the team. So we'll pat ourselves on the back for that one. And then one other item for cybersecurity, we conducted 5 events throughout the month of October, one available to the public to bring awareness to cybersecurity. Conducted a lot of outreach and awareness, had some guest speakers from the FBI, Secret Service, and Amazon come in to talk about their experiences and best practices, and we've got a lot of positive feedback from those events. So that was just one more thing on our plate, but we were very happy to do that, especially with the positive feedback that we received. So kind of short but sweet, but did Supervisor Simidian or Supervisor Chavez have any other questions for me?
Supervisor Chavez?
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the outreach that you're doing and really helping the organization think more about security in general. And I have some comments for later on, but I just wanted to acknowledge it's different here now with all of you and with Supervisor Simitian's leadership than it was 2 years ago. And that's a really, really good thing. So thank you.
Thank you. Who's up next?
Hi, I'm Mike Shapiro, Chief Privacy Officer, and I always like it when I can start off meetings with some good news to report. So I am currently no longer the sole member of the privacy team. We've just acquired 2 new senior management analysts, which I'm very excited about. They've been here around a month at this point, and
I'd like to congratulate you on 200% growth, so good for you.
That was going to be one of my other points, but thank you
All right.
for saying that. So
I can do that math. Thank you.
yeah, I'm very excited about it. So, so great to have them on board. They've been around for about a month now, and so far they've been showing really good promise. So excited to see what we can do with this new team. On the other hand, the first recruitment that we had for a program manager 2 was an unsuccessful one. So we didn't have any qualified candidates for that particular recruitment. I went ahead and had that reposted, so it is currently active out there now. Also had the job reported on the International Association of Privacy Professionals, IPP job board. So hopefully we'll get some more qualified candidates, some privacy professionals that will actually apply to that job, and hopefully I'll have some qualified candidates to be able to interview very soon. On a couple other notes, besides the unclassified positions that we're recruiting for now, I'm in the process of working with ESA to create new privacy job codes so that we have some real information privacy positions that we can market out there. So there's going to be about 5 positions that I want to try to create here at the county. They're going to be new job classifications. So I provided ESA with some job descriptions as samples. I provided them with salary data to try to get the ball rolling on that. And so I'm working with them now to try to get a head up on all those job studies for those positions. So hopefully we can get those approved sooner rather than later, but we'll certainly work side by side with them to get those through the process. And then finally, the other part I want to bring up is that I'm working with procurement right now to develop a pre-qualified list of vendors that will help me out and our team in the county with any issues that we may have with subject matter expertise support, any kind of search support that we may need, and any time that we need some extra help on hand. For instance, if we have requests, whether it's from the FGOC or board for for additional reports or additional analysis, that we can rely on them. As well as our own expertise to try to provide that, depending on what the call may be.
And before you move on, I just want to say I noted that when I read the report, and I thought that was a smart strategy so that, when the time comes, we're not captives of our own process, which sometimes I think we feel we are.
Sure, understand. So with the new team members in place, what this does is this gives us the opportunity to start executing on a lot of these things that we had planned over the past year. And one of the things, if you remember, we sort of understood a little bit earlier last year and I guess late in 2017 that while we're going through the process of evaluating surveillance technologies and the surveillance use policies, we understood that we were looking at the technologies themselves and doing the privacy vetting and the legal vetting, but we really weren't assessing what happens after that. And so you had called for developing a plan on actually assessing the databases that store that data once we collect it. And so I created that plan and I presented it. However, now we're actually in a position to where we can start executing on that plan. So with my team members in place, we have started the privacy impact assessment process on assessing those databases that store surveillance data. And so they're going through a bit of a pilot right now. They're new team members. We have a tool in place to be able to assess these databases. And so we're going through a couple of pilots. Once we get through that, kind of iron out some of the bugs, which are very typical in a new process. Once we go through that, then we'll start prioritizing a list based on risk and start hitting those different groups that have surveillance technologies and the databases that store them. And ultimately, what we want to drive to is to be able to identify where those gaps are in those databases, where those risks are. Specifically, the privacy risks where information could be exploited or extracted in ways that we don't want. So one of the extracts that we're going to get out of that is going to be a POAM, a plan of action of milestones. And what that is basically it's a dynamic list that track risks. And so any identified risks that we have, we're going to track them to either closure or to acceptance. But if anything else, what it'll do is it'll give us eyes to where those risks are and what we can do to remediate that, or what we are willing to accept for risks that aren't remediated. So with that, ultimately, we want to be able to develop some guidelines and some recommendations on moving forward for how we protect those databases that store surveillance data, because we can have everything from video recordings, audio recordings, from all across different departments around the county, including Sheriff's Office, DA, just a range of departments. So we want to make sure that we have those databases secure in a way, working with Justin and others to make sure that that information is protected. Ultimately, that will also help us when we develop those recommendations and guidelines to inform our privacy training in those areas where we see the greatest gaps, and especially in gaps in access and in how people handle information. Those are going to be areas that we really want to try to shore up through privacy training. And as we try to work through that training and develop and increase our privacy posture, one of the things that we tend to get from that are best practices. What are some scenarios that the county's done really well in, that our departments have really improved in, and that we really want to trumpet those causes? And so one of the ways that we could try to do that to show the good work that we're doing here at the county is through a Privacy Center of Excellence. And so I provided a plan on the Center of Excellence a while ago, and we'll get into more detail on this a little bit later at this meeting. But I just want to have a couple slides just to give you an idea of what we'll discuss later on. So as you know, and this is no secret to anybody, there's been a heightened increase in data breaches, and that's definitely sort of brought to the forefront privacy in a way that it hasn't, at least in recent history. So with all the rapid changes in technology and policy and privacy, it's a good idea for us as a county, being in Silicon Valley, to develop a Privacy Center of Excellence. And while we've talked about it a lot, we finally have a plan put in place, and we're starting now to go through that process of identifying those who'd like to be involved in that. And those are going to be contacts not only from government, but also industry, academia, and privacy advocates, as well as getting the public involved. So with that, the idea is that the plan is going to have strategic outcomes over a 3-year period, which we'll get into a little bit later. And we'll be working in consultation with some of our COE leaders that are going to be involved in this. And hopefully we will be able to come to something that we can agree upon and move forward with in order to provide services not only to the COE, but also to the public. And on this next slide here, I just want to give some examples of some focused hubs. Now, these hubs, as opposed to the privacy field in general, a lot of times people and organizations come into it from a very narrow or specific point of view. And while the COE can provide a forum for all voices, there are going to be certain interests that are going to say, all I really want to talk about or focus on is technology and privacy. Or, I'm in the financial services industry or criminal justice industry. I really want to focus on that more than anything else. And so we want to give them an opportunity to have their voices heard through hubs. So if they do have those specific privacy interests, that's going to be the place where they can go to get that kind of information. Like I said, we'll get into a little bit more detail in that a little bit later on in this meeting. But for right now, I would certainly be willing to entertain any questions about our privacy update.
I'm going to hold my questions until we get into the portion of the agenda that's specifically dedicated to the Privacy Center of Excellence.
Sure.
As will Supervisor Chavez.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
And next,
Laura Rosas, Ethics and Compliance Officer for Health and Hospital System. Happy to be here today with you all. So I'm going to provide some updates on our office. One of the updates is that I was able to join, I was accepted as a non-scientific member to the IRB at Valley Medical Center, where I help basically work with the IRB on identifying privacy issues and working with researchers on developing strategies on protecting privacy while pursuing their research. Also working on adherence and compliance with the Common Rule, which is the regulatory framework for research in the United States. It's been very rewarding, and a lot of value, I think, has come out of that collaboration between our office and the IRB. Also, we've launched some new modules in our new HealthStream education training system, which is how we train all of the employees in health and hospital system. We've got some enhanced privacy and compliance content to all HHS users, and we continue to work with the HealthStream team on working on developing and continuing to stay abreast of all the changes in both privacy and compliance to ensure that our staff are aware of those. It's a very powerful system and has a lot of value to it. We've centralized all the exclusion checking for the system for all employees per federal state regulations. All providers and clinicians and indeed employees have to be checked against a number of databases. One is the OIG, and to ensure that they have not been engaged in any kind of Medicaid or Medi-Cal fraud or Medicare fraud. So we've centralized that process through software, and we're able now to help everyone identify any issues. We're also expanding our alerts and fair warning to managers snooping into their employee records, employee snooping of other employees, and custom alerts, high access rates, or if a user is looking into HealthLink from multiple locations. So we're moving into these new alert areas. We've launched our 4th module in Compliance 360.
Forgive the interruption. We could stay with the fair warning, which I gather is software, yes?
Yes.
And this is for the entire panel and for Dr. Smith or any of his team or county council. Does the fair warning software work only with HealthLink?
It works on the EHR, so it's on currently.
I'm sorry, it works on?
Yes, it works. So Epic is our EHR. We call it HealthLink. And yes, it's fair warning integrates into Epic. And that's the only system that it's currently.
And EHR stands for?
Electronic health record.
Thank you. And so the reason I'm asking the question, and I've raised this issue with respect to other databases, for lack of a better way to describe it, is so we could not use this software, for example, in a criminal justice setting.
My understanding that fair warning is an electronic health record sort of system. I'm not aware of it being used in another type of system. It works for custody health where we have Epic. It certainly is working there. But I'm not aware of a fair warning interfacing with other systems, but there may be other vendors, and we can speak with fair warning and find out.
Well, here's, Dr. Smith, here's where I'd like to see if we can have some follow-up. Mm-hmm. We, as we have received the surveillance use policies for our review, and as we have looked at other databases and their use and potential for misuse or abuse over the last few years, I've sort of asked at various times, do we have systems in place that would highlight for us potential abuse or misuse? And in this case, you called out a very specific, it's expanding alerts for fair warning. You've described it as a software program. That's helpful. All good. You've also said that it helps identify potential inappropriate user access in HealthLink. That's all good. So now I'm asking myself, could we have the benefit of the same kind of tool in other places? Let me just give you a couple of examples. We know, because to their credit, folks in both the Sheriff's Department and in the District Attorney's Office, we know that there has been, at least from time to time, some misuse or access of criminal justice databases for non-law enforcement purposes, for personal purposes. Again, to their credit, those have been raised and presumably discipline has been forthcoming. But we've got lots of different databases in lots of different places, and we have lots of policies in place, and I think for the most part they're probably good policies that say, hey, you're not supposed to be poking around in this information unless it's for a bona fide purpose and you're the appropriately authorized person. But it's not clear to me that we have a way of making sure that those policies are actually being implemented. And I'm wondering whether a software technology like this, by some other brand name, might not be a useful technology to implement. Dr. Smith, you're looking perplexed. Was I baffling in my request?
No, I'm perplexed from what I'm thinking. We do have the capacity basically to audit access to essentially all of our database systems, but this program actually scans for suspicious behavior, and I know that there is one in the criminal justice. I'm not sure that we have one in all the other issues. Maybe Justin can answer that. I think we have to be notified of questionable behavior.
Yeah, it's certainly a particular use case for that type of product. I mean, we have data loss prevention services and solutions implemented, but for specific criminal justice information systems that hold that type of data, I'd have to defer.
Yeah,
Well,
we'll have
and I
to-
don't want to limit it to criminal justice because we have 21,000 employees. So, if 99.9% of them were good actors, which I think they are, just to be clear about that, that 0.1% ends up being a fairly significant number of people who would still have access to information that was not appropriately accessed. And whenever we talk about whether or not we do audits, I hear the phrase, and it's in the surveillance use policies, audit as needed, which is not terribly precise, and sometimes it's shall be at least once a year. But so what I'm looking for is whether or not there's some tools out there that we might use, both to identify problems when they arise, but more importantly to sort of put people on notice that if they engage in the practice, that might well be spotted, because I think right now there's not much reason to believe anyone's going to be identified for the misuse or abuse of the information. And
we'll get back to you next time with a complete explanation of what we do have and what might also be available on the market.
Okay. Today, let's see, we're in November already. So at our next meeting, which I think is at the end of this month, our next regularly scheduled meeting, if we could ask for at least a preliminary report back then. And, I understand all this has a cost, and there's a cost-benefit analysis the staff would want to go through. But as I said, what popped out at me here was the fact that it specifically is designed to search for patterns that suggest, hey, there might be something worth looking at over here. Supervisor Chavez, I see you leaning in.
So just on this item, and this really isn't directed at any one of you, but really just to follow up on the request for information that Supervisor Simitian's making, I think there are kind of two big buckets. One is a bucket around databases and information as it's stored in a way that, when taken, is a violation of someone's privacy and or inappropriate access. And that I think is one area that I know is worth us taking a deeper dive on, and I would be really interested in knowing how that's done today. I know that there's a lot of oversight, particularly accessing files within the public safety realm. So it'll be fun to hear what those are, because I'm not sure I know. But I'm also curious about another area, and that is when you have employees looking at other employees' emails and or employees, whether that's supervisors or coworkers, monitoring behavior, even that in an inappropriate way. And I just want to give an example of what I mean by that. Obviously we don't want people using computers inappropriately at work for any purpose. And so I know that we have some mechanisms for evaluating that. I also know that as we get access to more and more data, it's easier for us as an employer to monitor behavior and use that data for other purposes outside of training. And I've been made aware that we may not really have a shared understanding of what's appropriate and inappropriate oversight of our employees. And so, Dr. Smith, one of the other things I'd be interested in understanding is whether or not we have policies and procedures that match the tools we're using and where we think there may be a gap. The gap I would identify today is the one that I just raised that's much more ambiguous than someone invading a database, but whether or not we have employees and/or us as an employer inappropriately doing data collection with over computer usage.
We'll include that when we come back.
Thank you.
And in terms of the piece of the request that I've offered, everybody feel like they have clarity about what it is I'm trying to seek out here in the way of information? Thanks. And if you need to have follow-up conversation with me or my office, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry to have taken you off track. Please proceed.
Thank you so much. So we are also launching our fourth module of the Governance, Risk, and Compliance program that is part of Compliance 360. This one is focusing on third-party risk management, specifically ensuring that each of our contracts, when needed, if it's related to PHI and receiving PHI, protected health information, that there's a business associate agreement. So we're expecting to roll that out completely by April of next year. And finally, our office is becoming much more involved in department meetings and custody health and whole person care, behavioral health, and VHP. So we've really expanded our reach and the depth of our involvement and oversight. So I'm very excited about that change. I wanted to give you an update on the structure of our office. There was a ledge file a few weeks ago, and were asked for and were granted by the Board of Supervisors the ability to hire for 3 new FTEs to be focused on VHP, including a senior healthcare program manager and 2 healthcare compliance analysts. Also, we were successful in also expanding our staff. We now have Alireza Ahmadiyya, who is a senior healthcare program manager in our office, joined in end of August, and Moon Win, who also joined as a healthcare compliance analyst, and she is focusing on behavioral health. We're rolling out our privacy and data governance structure. We are going to have work groups at each of the departments, and those work groups will then feed into an ethics, privacy, and compliance committee comprised of leadership throughout the health system. And we're hoping that this will streamline a lot of our activities. It will provide oversight, but also visibility and transparency to data sharing, data requests, policies, procedures, and all of the efforts that we're undertaking to ensure that patients' information is protected, that the organization remains compliant, and that employees are protected as well. I think that's your slide. Do you have any questions I can answer?
Supervisor Chavez?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask one very broad question, and that is just given the just the incredible breadth of the work that you have ahead of you, you know, as we look at potentially purchasing new hospitals, how do you scale up to respond to the needs of now and more? I don't even need to say what more is. It's just a lot more.
So obviously, I'll speak about this in theoretical terms.
Of course.
Because the acquisition is still a pending matter. So I think we have a really robust compliance and privacy and ethics program. I think we have really excellent staff who are very dedicated, and a program that is scalable given additional resources. So obviously, we've asked if, you know, as we go through this, for additional resources. And my belief is that we need to have people who are part of our office that sit mostly full-time in these other organizations, because you really cannot, and I do see it as a, you know, we are supporting them. We are supporting the work of behavioral health. We are supporting the work of custody health. That is really the way I view our work. And you really cannot support an organization if you're not there on a day-to-day basis and you're not really embedded in the work and the meetings and in the issues that arise. So my vision is that we will have compliance, our staff, who understand compliance and privacy, and to whom we have a direct relationship, a reporting relationship at each of these departments, including the potential new hospitals that would come on board. And we've already started looking at how fair warning would scale out, how our Compliance 360 GRC would scale out, how the new training that we would need to undertake in HealthStream. We've already started thinking about those issues.
So and I don't know the answer to this, but and this may be a data security issue more than just compliance. I'm sure you're thinking about whether or not there are risks during interim transitions of any kind, and so I'm just going to leave it at that and say I'm sure that's true.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and then on one slide, and it's, I'm sorry, it's the slide that's labeled privacy and data governance structure. This hadn't really occurred to me till I saw that, but a lot of our health care information is with client partners, like our nonprofit partners.
Yes.
So, in these boxes, are those nonprofit partners also getting support and training from you?
So I think you're referring to the CBOs.
Yeah, I'm talking about the
community behavioral-
FQHC, yeah.
So not at the moment because they have their own systems. So we have not engaged with them specifically because they have their separate organization, their separate structure, and we don't share an IT system with them specifically. We have around some areas, but we have not engaged with them. But I'm certainly happy to take that under advisement.
Well, I would just ask Dr. Smith, I'm not trying to give you more work, but I would just ask Dr. Smith this question. It appears to me that as part of the work that you've been doing with the clinics, that some of that is around shared data and access, and that we are, in fact, expanding HealthLink into these nonprofit partners. So one of the reasons I thought that was actually a very good idea was because I thought we had a better ability to protect the integrity of the whole data stream. And so if we're not already doing training with those partners that have access to Epic, or I'm sorry, HealthLink, whatever the appropriate name is, I'd be interested in understanding how that will happen and what the timeline looks like for that, or if you think it's necessary.
I don't know that I can speak with authority on that. We've relied upon the individual clinics to maintain their security and the information that they glean from using HealthLink, which is actually not most of the clinics. We haven't followed it as it goes through their system, but we can certainly look into it.
It may be of value to work with some of the larger clinics that I know we are already really actively engaged with, to do at least an audit to determine what level of support is necessary there.
Will do.
Thank you.
Can I stay on this issue with you for a minute? Yeah, I've raised this issue before in passing, and I think to Supervisor Chavez's point, as our systems become more and more integrated and as there is more and more sharing, I mean, I know I don't need to tell you, amidst all the excitement and enthusiasm in the healthcare world about electronic health records and the benefits they bring, there has been, in my view, a less than commensurate concern about what the privacy implications of electronic health records and sharing might entail. I'll just try and be as tactful as I can. My understanding, to Supervisor Chavez's point, is that clinics, Dr. Smith, who are now our partners in some of this work out there in the community-based organization world, do in fact have access to our database.
Right. So if I could clarify my
Please.
answer. So there are some community organizations that have access to HealthLink, and they do receive training. In order to have access to HealthLink, there has to be training. That's part of the requirements of even being able to.
And if I can pause, ask you to pause and thank you, just because I want to make sure I'm tracking everything you said. So when you say that there are some clinics out there, they do have access to HealthLink.
They have limited access. They're not actually into all of the, we don't have HealthLink necessarily in their offices. There's some different ways of accessing Epic. There's hyperspace, which is full access. There are some other ways that are less access.
Then let me
There's
ask the question.
read-only access. So there's a number of different ways to access Epic. If someone is given access to Epic, they do receive training, but not all of our CBOs have access to Epic, and it is not rolled out completely in that way yet.
Here's Epic. It's our database. Yes? Is that a fair use of the term
Yes.
of art? Okay. Here's the clinic out here that has access. Does somebody over here at the clinic have the ability to look up the health record of a patient over here in Epic?
If they've been granted access, if they've been trained, yes.
And some of them have been granted access, and some of them have been trained, yes?
But not complete. It depends. There are, as I said, there are a number of different ways of accessing Epic. Some are broader than others. We've tried to really push to have it narrow.
Understood. So the least I can do is share my question since you're sharing
ahead.
your
No,
question.
go ahead.
So, but then when you say as long as they've been trained, which then leads me to say how much of their training is around the privacy protections and protocols. So how is it the same as what we do for our own employees who are part of who have access?
There is definitely privacy and security training that is part of their access. And also a part of it is using the record appropriately, understanding our rules and how we access data. So there definitely is that piece of it. I can look into that more specifically. You are right. There is a tension in between the great, first of all, there's explosion in data, period. And secondly, there's also a number of pay-for-performance programs. Whole Person Care is a really good example of a program that really wants to facilitate care coordination, the sharing of data. So there's the tension of that paired with privacy. And so I think that is basically where our office is. It really, we are every day trying to ensure that when we're sharing data, it is done within the law and with the regulations and with what the expectation of patients are as to where their data is going to go.
And I'm still over here at the community-based organization, and my question is, if there were behaviors there that inside Epic would trigger fair warning, does fair warning cover the folks over here?
I believe so. Anytime anyone is accessing hyperspace in Epic, we are able to identify that through fair warning.
And I don't think, and I apologize if you've had to hear me tell this story 3 times already, but I think you're a recent enough rival that that won't be the case. You know, I was in the state legislature when First Lady Maria Shriver's medical information was compromised at the UCLA Med Center, which got quite a bit of attention. And I remember thinking at the time, all right, if the First Lady of the state of California can't feel secure in terms of her medical privacy, then really who can? And I would doubt, notwithstanding all the various sign-offs that people have to provide, that most people who come through VMC are aware of the fact that their information is accessible, both theoretically and in fact, to a bunch of strangers in a different healthcare organization who we hope follow the rules, but who may not. So back to you, Supervisor Chavez.
Well, what I was going to say, and I think you touched on this, is that one of our objectives has not really been to narrow our sharing of information, but really has been to expand it so that we can provide the best services we can. And so, I understand the point you raise around the tension therein, but my hope is that, and part of the reason I would be interested in us auditing, especially the larger nonprofits that should have more access, then that we better understand how to protect that partnership and have the availability of the information they need. In particular, I'm thinking about this in part because I've been thinking about this relative to custody health too, and one of the things that all of us who are working on reentry want to make sure of is that all the services that get provided in custody, that information gets to whoever their partner is, so we're not wasting, frankly, healthcare dollars, no matter whose book that's on, but also that we're able to provide the best service. So I just will reinforce that my intent is, as I'm asking these questions, is really not to narrow access. It's to make the access whatever it needs to be to really help people's health thrive, and at the same time, better understanding where the risks are along that route, mostly so that we can do the very best we can to be protective. But I have personally felt like since I got here, the tension between our ability to share information in some instances where it feels like these are self-inflicted wounds in terms of our ability to share information between organizations that really only harm the person that we're most trying to help and therefore protect. And so whatever that balance is. But anyway, I just want to really emphasize that audit is important. And I think the point that Supervisor Simidian raised is for the techno peasants up here, and I'm grouping you in with me, not you, but you, that understanding the connection, you use some programmatic language, but really understanding the connection and therefore understanding the risk. Again, maybe that's not an appropriate thing to understand in open session, but really just to help us as policymakers as we're pushing for more access to better understand the tensions that you're trying to protect us from, or risks that you're trying to protect us from.
And let me follow up on some of the, I think, you make important points about sort of the real world tensions that people confront, which some might characterize as on the one hand and on the other hand. But I was here 20 years ago on the Children and Families Committee, as it was then called. We talked about, wouldn't it be great if our schooling services program, for example, allowed greater sharing of information between and among various agencies who had overlapping responsibilities for kids in our school system. And we all thought, gee, that would be a great benefit, and that's what Supervisor Chavez is talking about. But if people are worried that sharing that information means that it won't be held safe, then there will be less sharing, and that less sharing will mean that clients are less well served, and so there's a real world consequence to that. Now, to take it just back into the world of healthcare for a minute, regrettably, there remains a stigma around mental health care. And the fact that that stigma exists means it's sometimes less likely people will step forward and ask for the help that they think they need. And if they think that some stranger or someone who knows them is going to be able to access that information simply by walking up to a database and helping themselves to information in a different organization's database, you can see why someone might not step forward then and seek the help that they need and deserve. Same is true for various STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, where there continues to remain a stigma. And our Health and Hospital Committee under Supervisor Yeager's leadership has been doing everything it can to address the ongoing challenge of AIDS and our Getting to Zero campaign. Unfortunately, the stigma is still there. I think people are going to be less likely to seek the help that they need if they feel that that information is at risk and that their privacy could be compromised. So these are the real world tensions around these issues. And as I say, it's why for a long time I've been little more anxious about the implications of electronic health records while people have been excited, understandably, and about the potential. Why don't we let you finish your results, and then we'll go on to item number 5 after we hear from one member of the public who has a card in.
Thank you so much. And I definitely agree with all of your concerns. They are the same concerns that I have, definitely. So just to go quickly follow up, we have working groups that we are developing for each of these departments. My goal is to have these meet every month to develop policies and procedures to discuss the data sharing issues, the patient privacy issues, potential training that may be needed, and then take those issues and bring them to an ethics, privacy, and compliance committee that is comprised of leadership throughout HHS, and that would then bring those to the forefront of issues that need to be resolved. One of the issues that we deal with a lot is data requests, and a lot of them are data requests around care coordination. Although it's important to remember that for treatment, payment, and operations, HIPAA does allow the exchange of information. So we continue to work in a very evolving and very innovative landscape, and we think that this will really help be able to get our arms around all of that work and really be able to support the departments who are doing such important work.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything else on item number 4?
No, I think that is completed. Thank you.
All right. Well, we do have one card on item number 4, and that's from Susan Bassey. Ms. Bassey, if you want to come on up, We'll set aside 2 minutes. Cindy, would you?
Thank you. Cindy, you made a comment in the beginning about outreach, thanking somebody for outreach. Our outreach continues to still be zero outside of this community. You're not reaching out to the media. You're not reaching out to members of the public that can give you meaningful feedback that is needed beyond people that you're paying and people who vote for you, and you've got to start reaching out to those people. Your comments later were excellent, where you talked about appropriate and inappropriate use of employee policies. You talked about, how will we determine what is appropriate to view? How do we look at emails? And I thought of 2 examples for you. One of them would be the example of, we have police officers trained in this county, and on November 14th, Officer Gomez seized my phone out of my hand, and then he began to search my phone. I've discussed this with my colleagues in the press, and there is absolutely nothing more chilling to somebody who's a member of the press to have your data searched. That has our sources, that has our confidential sources and information, that has our whistleblower information. Officer Gomez had no right to my phone. We know that he searched my phone because he turned it on. It wasn't in my hand. He turned it on. That is highly inappropriate. So if our police officers who have the highest training don't have the training to be able to manage privacy correctly, how are we going to even manage policies for people who are looking at people's emails? For instance, people who were looking at the emails of the claims manager inside our district attorney's office. There was an affair going on with the claims manager and a subordinate. They were having an affair that resulted in 2 divorces. Who was looking at their emails? Why was that not caught? Why was that not appropriate? And the last thing I want to leave you with is our county courts have been violating people's privacies, which has been part of my investigation, by leaving CP information and fee waiver information
Thank
out.
you very much.
It violates all the privacy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that takes us to item number 5, which is to receive the report from the Chief Privacy Officer relating to Privacy Center of Excellence. So.
All right, Mike Shapiro again, Chief Privacy Officer. So we talked a little bit before about the Privacy Center of Excellence at the county that we're just trying to establish here and working with our public-private partnership. And some of the information I have here is really for when we reach out to those partners with with kind of describing a little bit about the county. Some of our industry partners and our government partners may already know this, but others, especially those that may be interested in joining the COE or participating or listening in when we have sessions, may not necessarily know what the County of Santa Clara is, what we're comprised of. So we just wanted to give them an idea that we are the heart of Silicon Valley and a few stats on that.
Can you go back to the last slide,
yes,
please?
Sure.
If I look at the 3rd bullet, do I correctly infer from that the economy of Santa Clara County is greater than the economy of the entire nation of Switzerland?
That's what we've been getting from, at least from the McKinsey report. That's correct.
All right, good to know. I'm sure that'll come in handy sometime soon. Thank you.
Sure. We wanted to have a little bit of a wow effect, I guess, when we were reaching out to folks to try to get them on board.
Thank you.
Sure. So we also wanted to explain a little bit about the board as well and who comprises that, and we will make updates as necessary. And then also some of the county departments, especially the big ones that we see that have a lot of data.
Mr. Shapiro, I hate to do this to you, but one of the updates I think you need to make right now is that Supervisor Yeager's name is spelled incorrectly, I believe.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Thank
we'll
you.
go ahead and make that correction.
Thank you.
And so anyways, the departments, we just wanted to show the big ones there that where you see a lot of data transfers take place, or where you see that have the most data collection points, as well as that could have the most privacy risk. And so we just wanted to show sort of the breadth and depth of the types of data and the types of considerations that we had. And as I was talking to folks, a lot of times people don't quite understand, what the county does if they've never really been involved with the county, if they've never had to, come to a board meeting or a committee meeting or really delved into doing research about the county. And when you explain to them, you say, we're county government. And they say, oh, well, what's that about? Then you say, well, we have, criminal justice information, we have registrar of voters information, we have healthcare information, we have tax collection information. So we have kind of a large range of information across, a huge constituency of adults and children alike. So you can imagine, besides having all that data, all the privacy risks and exposure risks that can be there. So we wanted to try to show, maybe some of our industry and academic partners who may not be aware of the types of departments that we have and the types of information and people that we work with. So just wanted to also push out a little bit when we're doing kind of our promotional campaign here, just sort of the commitment that we have from the county here, lives through the surveillance technology ordinance that we had, the development of the Office of Privacy, and the establishment of the Center of Excellence. So it really goes to show this county's commitment, unlike a lot of other counties, even many states, that they don't quite have this commitment in place to really show that dedication. So I think that will help kind of bolster support and gain a little bit of interest in a Center of Excellence that's focused right here in Silicon Valley. And some of the benefits of a COE that can be extended throughout the community are really trying to raise sort of the collective bar across Silicon Valley. And so it's to really establish this as the epicenter. Around the state of California, there are some kind of, little sprouts coming up of interest in privacy, but I think we're positioned very well to sort of take a leadership role in that in the state. And I think considering sort of the partners that we have and just our location, it's going to be a little bit easier for us to draw them to meetings and to events just by the sheer size and the technology industry partners that we have here. Some of the other things that we have on this slide do talk about how we want to reach out to government, other governments and academia and privacy advocates. But also I wanted to make an extra point clear about community outreach, because a lot of times we talk about public-private partnerships, we're talking about industry and privacy advocates as well as local and state government. But we can't forget that a large part of what we do is to try to say not only how do we help our county employees, but how do we do outreach to the community and make sure that consumers have the tools that they need, that our best practices that we learn in the COE are pushed out to the community so that we can provide them with guidance that they need in order to protect their privacy as well, and to show them some of the good work that we're trying to do with our partners. So we mentioned a little bit about sort of the partnership that we want to have. This just kind of shows you sort of the conglomeration that we want to try to bring to the table. I've reached out, and my team as well, I've reached out to some people already across industry and academia, and so we do have some partners on board, and I got to tell you, the reception that we've been getting so far has been pretty positive. People very interested in taking part in that. So we have representatives interested in it from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, from Lyft, from the City of San Jose, UC Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, the Providence Group, the Future of Privacy Forum, Cisco, and then some other contacts we're looking to reach out to include Gallup, Google, U.S. Patent Trade Office, Stanford Electronic Frontier Foundation, and ACLU NorCal. So that's just kind of a subset of some of the contacts that we have and that we're looking forward to. I'm also going to be attending a Privacy War Games event that's going to be in a couple weeks on November 13th. So during that event, there's going to be representatives there, and I've actually been offered an opportunity to speak at their lunch session to try to promote the Privacy Center of Excellence as well. So it'll be an interview session where there's going to be representatives that are going to be there from Microsoft, Warner Brothers, Visa, and several other organizations within the area. So I'm excited about that. I think that'll be a really good opportunity to not only show what we're doing here at the county and our Privacy Center of Excellence, but also to expand our participation and membership into the COE. So once we identify some of those organizations, the next key part is going to be identifying individuals within those organizations. And we already have kind of a short list developed already, and hopefully we'll be able to extend that through some other privacy events that are coming around shortly. And then eventually we want to get together kind of that core group of people, that leadership group, and work on sort of developing our charter, which will include the strategy and defining an organizational structure. Now, through the COE plan that I shared with you not too long ago, we provided kind of a draft of that plan, because I don't like going into a new situation and not at least having something in place to go off of. So instead of just having a free-form brainstorming session, I wanted to give at least something to go off of as a baseline, and then from there we can work on what is the best structure, what is the best mission and goals that we want to support as a COE from there. We mentioned briefly during our last session about some of the privacy hubs that we can offer. So this is for those people who are part of the Center of Excellence that really want to get a deeper dive into something very specific. So they'll have the kind of general interest group, and so for some of those specific points of it, for instance, in the privacy policy law and guidance, some of the topics that I think will be really hot that are coming up are going to be the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That is the new law that was just passed recently and is going to affect not only the state of California, but we think will have far-reaching impacts across the United States. That's something that I think will be a hot topic, especially between now and January 1st of 2020 when it goes into effect. Some of the other topics in that hub may be the Global Data Protection Regulation, which is GDPR. Although that has been implemented, it hasn't been challenged yet. And so while a lot of American companies have used Privacy Shield thinking that it can provide adequate privacy protection, that hasn't been challenged yet. So we don't know necessarily if Privacy Shield is going to be considered adequate by the European Union. So I think GDPR is still going to be somewhat of a hot topic as we go into the next year or two. And then, of course, surveillance technology. That's something that our county has certainly taken a lead on, and even we see a bill in the state right now that's being considered that is very similar to the surveillance technology and community safety ordinance here that we have passed at the county. So I think that does show how the county is a trailblazer in the state and how we can continue to do that through the Privacy COE. Other examples for hubs include technology and privacy. So that can be emerging technologies. Being in Silicon Valley, we have a lot of the tech firms that are here that are developing those technologies. So it'd be wonderful to bring them on board to discuss that. I think a lot of times emerging technologies have, they think about how fast can we push to market. And they do not think about what are the privacy implications of that. So not that we want to put the brakes on advancing technologies, but we want to make sure that it's done responsibly. We want to make sure the privacy considerations are in play. And I think by having industry to the table as well as our own voices and privacy advocates there, we can make sure that very important step isn't negated or, or overlooked.
Just a quick interruption, forgive
Sure.
me. I've I think my observation over time would be that any organization that is mission-driven is understandably focused on the mission, and that therefore privacy is often an incidental afterthought, if it even becomes an afterthought. And folks at a hospital are trying to keep us healthy and save lives, and they're focused on that, and that may mean that considerations of privacy are secondary, absent some effort to make sure that they stay top of mind. Folks in law enforcement are trying to keep us safe. They're trying to catch bad guys, and that may mean privacy issues are sometimes secondary in their thinking. Again, it's not a criticism. It's, to your point, people are focused on their mission. If it's bringing a product to market, that's driving them, without necessarily consideration of these other factors. So I think you're wise. I mostly wanted to sort of underscore the fact that I think it's human nature to, when you're mission driven, to be focused on the mission, and that means somebody's got to then be in a position to say, hey, don't forget about. Back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that swings nicely into one of the other hubs right after that, privacy by design and lifecycle management. Is exactly that, and a lot of times privacy is considered an afterthought, and we want to make sure that industry and academia and other organizations are thinking about privacy up front when they're considering new technology development. So we want to make sure that privacy is baked into a product instead of bolted on afterwards. It tends to work a lot better when you come out at the end. It may take a little extra time. The hope is that by using privacy by design, the first iteration takes a little while, the second iteration a little less time, and the third iteration so on until it becomes second nature. And that's sort of what we're looking at driving at by the Privacy by Design Hub. And for those that are interested in the integration of privacy and system development, as well as legacy system redesign. So some of the other areas as well, including privacy training, awareness, and outreach. It's great if you have some good privacy tips and best practices in place, but if nobody knows about it, or if it's just a slide presentation and people just kind of click through it and that's it, if that isn't having a true impact, if that's not really driving change, if there aren't fewer data breaches in place, then that's not really having the desired effect. And so as we saw from the Attorney General report from 2013 to 2015, out of government institutions in particular, the #1 rate of data breaches occurred because of error rates, and that was 50%. So 50% of the breach events were errors, simply accidents that employees or contractors were doing, not because they had ill intent, but because they were just maybe being a little bit mindless or didn't think that there was an issue with releasing information or leaving information exposed. So we want to make sure that through a privacy training hub, for example, that we're able to kind of explain ways to say, this isn't just rote training material. Here are true impacts to what can happen if privacy isn't considered. And so hopefully through that, that'll be something that that group can focus on and try to create training that actually has true impact. From there, the last point for hubs will be something that we'll consider doing industry hubs. So while there may be concerns about privacy in particular, like you mentioned a little bit before, people are concerned, well, I work in the criminal justice sphere, so I'm more concerned about what criminal justice information concerns we have, surveillance information concerns that we have, and how do we deal with privacy in those matters. It could be online consumer protection, healthcare privacy, finance privacy, and identity theft, and social services. So there's a range of different fields and industries that could be focus groups within hubs. Once we, sort of develop as a COE, get to talking to the membership and determine, what are the hubs that you're most interested in, then we'll drive and come down to the kind of short list where we can get the most participation and we'll have the most impact. So that's where we're driving at with the hubs. Some of the roles and responsibilities, of course, we have the privacy COE. They, of course, have the big role of being able to foster a center of excellence and privacy excellence as well to go along with that. The leadership here at the county, whether that's executive leadership, people like myself and the supervisors and so on, to be able to have the support that we've currently had and to continue to have to make sure that we don't just establish it and forget it, but that we establish it and that it has a sense of longevity or sustainability. So the continued support of the county leadership is going to be essential to making sure that we drive this to success. And then for my role in particular, up there I have myself, Chief Privacy Officer, but we also have the Chief Privacy Officers and other privacy leaders with other industry and corporate and academic partners that also need to be committed to this as well. But for my part, we want to make sure that we keep the initiative alive, we encourage participation, we make sure that we talk about topics that matter and stay relevant, and then promote those best practices. So that'll be something that's going to be a big responsibility on myself, but certainly within other Chief Privacy Officers that are going to be involved in this COE. And then, of course, industry, making sure that we talk about government being involved and how can industry play a part in it. I don't want to necessarily think of industry as having a direct tension there. There's going to be tensions, but at the same time, they're also going to be the partners that can create privacy-enhancing technologies that help protect information. And so, trying to reach out to them to make sure that they have a seat at the table as well, because they are big players in the amount of information they hold. They're also big players in the types of software they can develop to protect data. And then, of course, academia. We've reached out to our academic partners. They are definitely very excited to be part of this. They do a lot of good research, perhaps in emerging technologies, which means also emerging privacy issues from those technologies that a lot of us just haven't even considered yet. So in a lot of ways, they're our eyes into the future, and they help us kind of decide and discuss, what are the biggest privacy topics that are not just current, but are coming up into our horizon that we need to consider going forward. And then, of course, our privacy advocates. Those are the folks that kind of make sure that there's that balance there, to make sure we don't get too far ahead of ourselves with our technological progress. Not that we want to impede that progress, but that we want to make sure that privacy is taken responsibility when we make that progress happen. So they'll certainly have a seat at the table. We do have some initial interest there as well. So we'll certainly be excited to have them on board. I think for our part, and I can't understate this, is that we want to make sure that this is a place where all those voices can come to the table. We know that there's going to be tension, and sometimes that's good. There can be a healthy tension there, because I think we can all learn from that by seeing what another's perspective are. So that's something that we certainly want to foster and make sure that people are welcome to this Center of Excellence. The goals and objectives, I mentioned briefly that we do have kind of a framework for that. As you saw in the more detailed report that I provided before in the plan, we have that kind of bolted out and we have that baseline there. But certainly we want to reach out and make sure that this 3-year timeline that we have is feasible for all the different goals that we want to try to accomplish. Make sure that folks are on board with it, and then also understand what are ways that we can change that. If we can accelerate that time frame, more than happy to try to accommodate that where it's feasible. Where people have the bandwidth to do that, and where people can certainly stay attentive and be participative of that process. So right now, we want to promote a cadence of looking at this from 6 months, 1 year, 2 year, and 3 years out. And some of the objectives that we want to do that are going to be presented here in a little bit in the next couple slides. But we really want to try to promote sort of the advances not only in the regulatory landscape that we've seen very recently in the state of California, but we're also seeing at the federal level as well. We'll see if that really takes traction at the federal level, but they've certainly been talking about it more recently than they have in a long time, whether it's the gathering of state attorney generals in Washington, whether it's the gathering at the Senate hearings that's been taking place as they've been questioning people about privacy more now than they have in the past. So we'll be discussing that, and I'm sure that those will be hot topics when we bring the COE together and we start having discussions about privacy topics of interest as we have our meetings. And this is a little bit small type here, but it goes into the actual 3-year plan that we have laid out. I won't go into this in great detail. You have that at your table there. You can discuss it.
We do, and I may have missed it. The day one of the 3-year plan starts or started when? Because I'm already planning the celebration for 3 years out. So I want to know what was day one.
So right now, what I wanted to do is go to the Privacy War Games event to really get a better sort of grouping together and to get that short list developed. And then, of course, we have to get through the Thanksgiving holiday. So looking at the first week in December is really being that day one.
All right. And let me ask you to condense the rest of this by asking this question. So if that's day one, that's December 1st of 2018. 3 years later is December 1st, 2021, yes?
Yes.
How is the world a better place by virtue of this endeavor? How is our world a better place?
Well, I think right now with where we're starting off, and this is no surprise to any of us, with the number of data breaches that have occurred, with the breadth and depth of them, with the number of records that have been out there, the data points that have been brought together that should have never been brought together. So I think the idea is in 3 years from now, if we have the industry partners in place, we're able to suggest and recommend best practices and solutions to that we'll be able to prevent things like the data breaches that have happened that shouldn't have occurred. We'll be able to promote to these industry advocates the way that they can develop privacy policies, not only online that they splash up there for their consumers and customers, but also how they can implement those in practice. So how can they really include privacy by design in their software development lifecycle? Those are some of the things that we certainly feel will be provided value that we can do within a 3-year time frame.
Okay. Go back to your report. Thanks. I'm sorry to take you off track.
No problem. So this timeline right here, again, I won't get into great detail because it is a little bit too arduous here for this meeting, but the major phases being we want to set up and establish the COE, and then from the next year to two, we want to be able to strengthen that. So once we get on our feet, we want to be able to have a cadence of having more privacy topic discussions. Those can be monthly calls where there's a privacy topic of interest, combined with privacy events that bring more of the public into the sphere and getting them involved. And then once we start getting into the phase 3 enhance, we want to be able to start to push out and start to think, how can we actually create solutions that are going to matter? How can we do more outreach to the public that will get them on board to understand ways that they can directly protect their own privacy, whether that's setting something as simple as setting their online privacy settings within their social media profiles, to be able to identify how social media bots can affect political discourse, and to be wary of social media bots who are not real people that could try to influence them in elections. So those are examples of how we can work on community outreach. Other parts are being able to provide them with a line to who they can contact for a little bit more information. And right now, I think that's a little bit confusing out there. If you ask someone if they've had an issue that they feel that their privacy or their social media profile, or they've had an identity theft incident happen to them, a lot of times people, members of the public, just don't know where to go. And so we want to be able to offer them, at least some information about where they can generally go to get a little bit more guidance to try to help them through those matters. And ultimately the goal, hopefully within 3 years, I can't say there won't be any incidents ever of privacy, but what I will say is that hopefully we'll be better positioned so that we don't see sort of the level of breaches that we do, and when breaches do occur, we'll be able to recover and understand them better and learn from them for the future. And then some of the next steps that we are trying to promote as well is to discuss the strategic plan that, in part we went over in this presentation, to establish that COE charter once we get that core group together, and then really start to implement on that strategic plan. And some of those things that we want to do so that we keep interest alive is identify those priorities and some of those quick wins so that we can show impact right up front. And then ultimately to kind of agree on, basic things that we have whenever we bring a new group together, such as meeting cadence, events that we want to promote, membership, and so on. So those are the basic constructs of getting the COE off the ground and to at least try to develop the framework that we want to make sure it's sustainable for the future. And right now, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
No, thank you. I did I did want to sort of understand what the 3-year timeline looked like. I think the risk of stating the obvious, it takes a lot of continued focus to keep an organization of this size and complexity on task on an issue like this that, as I said earlier, I think many will see as ancillary to their day-to-day responsibilities. And I understand that. It's unfortunate, but that's the real world. You know, it would be great if we could say we look forward to having this all wrapped up in 6 months. That's not going to happen. But I do want to encourage you to make sure, working both with our full board and with this committee, that you continue to try and keep us on task and on the timeline that you've laid out to make all this happen. Mr. Marquez, in Dr. Smith's absence, and he may rejoin us here in a minute, or Mr. Shapiro, are there issues here that need to be brought to the full board, or at this point are we okay with just having the report to our FGOC committee?
I think we're okay with FGOC report, okay. Report out.
And now, just to show you that I lured him back under false pretenses, are there resource implications? Are there dollars and cents issues here that we're going to have to confront in order to make some of these things happen?
I think there may need to be some as we progress into the future. We'll kind of identify those as we get more involved with the COE later on.
The answer to that is yes.
Okay. and that will be part of the ongoing budget conversation year after year after year, yes?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that those conversations are now part of the budget process year after year after year. That was one of the goals, was to make sure that we had the conversation. We do have a couple of folks who have submitted cards. I want to turn to them and see if they are anxious. And then I have one sort of closing comment before we move on to the next item, which is a little bit in a category of its own. Susan Bassey, if she is still here. I think she's had to leave us. And then Doug Muirhead has a card in. Mr. Muirhead, you want to come on up?
Thank you, Supervisor Simidian. Good afternoon, staff. For the record, my name is Doug Muirhead. I live in Morgan Hill. I'm quite sure this comment is going to be off topic, but I believe Supervisor Simidian opened the door by talking about corporate missions not being focused on privacy. There are relatively unknown but large data mining firms, and I'm not talking about the credit card bureaus, that work very hard to take privacy away from people, from individuals, package that information together and sell it to governments who want to do background checks, businesses that want to do background checks and other things. And so I really don't know how to link that to your center of excellence, but there's been a lot of talk of privacy. There's been a lot of talk of engaging with the public. And I'm concerned that the existence of these companies and what they do with our data is not well known, and perhaps there's some sort of tension between what they're going to be trying to do and what you are going to be trying to do on behalf of both the county and our residents. And so, since I felt that maybe the door had opened a little bit, I thought I'd slip that comment in.
Thank you very much. Oh, no, I think it's entirely on point, Mr. Muirhead. Thank you. Before we wrap up this item, I want to say to all three of the presenters, thank you. And to all who are present and or who are listening, I do think that one of the challenges, Dr. Smith, that we're going to confront is that if everybody does their job really well, there'll be nothing to talk about, and that could end up, lulling us into a sense of complacency that's not appropriate or helpful going forward. A lot of the work we do, we measure with metrics. Some are simple, some are complicated. How many visitors to the park? How many patients did we serve? And on this one, we're never going to be able to count the number of breaches that didn't occur. the number of records that weren't compromised by virtue of the training or the technology. So, you know, it's always a pleasure to hear from the three of you who are here, but in some respects, no news is good news. And so I guess I want to close by just saying I look forward to not hearing from you except on regularly scheduled events as part of our quarterly update process. Dr. Smith, anything on that before we go to the final item number 6?
Well, the only thing I would say is I think, you know, we're, from an administrative perspective, very confident in the team before you, and we're going to be challenged, as you say, to transition the culture throughout the entire organization, because anytime you try to change significant behaviors and culture, you know, it takes time and it's a challenging effort, but I'm very confident that we'll make that progress, and you know, very supportive, and we know that we will be coming back asking for more resources, both technical and in personnel matters, as we move on, but we want to do it in a stepwise, thoughtful manner so that we make sure we don't waste resources on things that look bright and shiny but aren't quite right now.
All right. Thank you. Then without objection, we'll deem the report received, and thank you all very much. We move on now to item number 6. All right. Now, who's going to present on this one? Is that you again, Mr. Shapiro?
Yes, it is.
I'm going to ask that we change it up just a little bit on this one and ask, I see we have a number of folks from the Sheriff's Department who've been kind enough to be with us. First of all, thank you for participating and sitting through the last hour and a half now. If I could ask the Sheriff's Department folks who know most about this facial recognition technology to come down. I've just got a quick threshold question I want to ask if somebody here knows the answer, because it will help me at least make better use of the report we're going to get from Mr. Shapiro. So, Mr. Shapiro, you can stay right there if you're comfortable there. And if you'd introduce yourself for the record, just even though we know who you are.
Good evening, or good afternoon, President Simitian, Assistant Sheriff Ken Binder.
Thank you, Mr. Binder. We, as you know, have an agenda item today, item 6, on facial recognition technology, and the item is the result, at least in part, of the surveillance use policy process that we're embarked upon, and we got a surveillance use policy for facial recognition software, and at least my reaction was, that raises some larger questions beyond just the language of the 2.5-page policy. And the policy talks about the fact that the sheriff's personnel shall only use facial recognition software during a criminal investigation to assist in the identification of unknown persons associated with a specific criminal investigation, and then talks again specifically about saying we got a database full of pictures over here and we know who these folks are. We got a picture of somebody over here. We're trying to identify who he or she is, and we're using the technology that we have to try and identify this person from among these many people and see if there's a match. Is that a accurate, albeit grossly oversimplistic explanation of what the technology is being used for?
Yes, it is.
Thanks. And it would help, and here are my couple of threshold questions because I'm just trying to understand how you really use this thing in your everyday work. So is this something that, I don't know, is this something you use a dozen times a year, 100 times a year, 1,000 times a year? How often does this technology get used?
Yes, we actually did an audit not too long ago over the last couple of years, and we do not use the system very often. I would say probably less than a dozen times a year.
Thank you, because I'm just trying to get some sense of the scope of what's going on here. Sure. And then could you give us a couple of examples, a couple of, because I'm thinking to myself, right, I know you're, or at least I think I know, that you're looking at this group of folks over here who might be a collection of folks that you've got what we colloquially call mugshots on, and you're trying to figure out whether this person over here is one of these people over here. Forgive my aerial PowerPoint here. And so that means you get a picture of this person over here. Where do those pictures come from?
Yeah, sure. So primary example would be a bank robber walking in and taking money from a teller. Surveillance footage, we've got a good shot of the person. We might take that static photograph and then compare it to our arrestee mugshot database to see if there's any returns.
If you had somebody, do you have situations where you have somebody in custody who simply refuses to identify themselves, and you say, great, let's take a picture and run it through the database and see if we can figure out who this person is? Or is that a hypothetical that you've not encountered?
That would not be with this system. I mean, our booking system, we do have a booking system where if someone is refusing to identify themselves, they would go down and have fingerprints taken and see if we can get a match that way. Generally is how we would do that.
And do I understand correctly from the information that's been provided that, at least at present, your department is not taking images from body cams and then matching those body cam images up against the database using this technology?
Yeah, that is correct. Actually, in two different parts of the policy, the first and the third section, we specifically say that this is for static photographs to be compared. And we do not use it for anything other than that.
Okay. But again, just to be clear, meaning not from the body-worn cameras.
Oh, correct. Yeah, we do not, there's no connection with our body-worn camera system.
And understanding that its use is limited, how often does it work for you? Half the time, quarter of the time, once in a blue moon, but it's still worth trying?
It's probably the last option you said. It's generally, our detectives will use it to see if they can generate a lead, but it seems to, the technology's older and it doesn't seem to be particularly efficient at this point.
Great. I've got some other questions as we go through the presentation, but I thought, Supervisor Chavez, just be sort of helpful. We're having this conversation about the technology, but I thought it'd be helpful to understand, okay, in the context of what real-world experience that our Sheriff's Department is having on a day-to-day basis. So if you're okay, I'll go back to Mr. Shapiro. Okay. And please feel free to sit wherever you're comfortable today. So
Thank you, Supervisor.
we'll go back to you, Mr. Shapiro.
If you or Supervisor Chavez has any other questions, I'll be happy to come back up.
All right. Thanks so much.
Sure, thank you. I'll go ahead and start up with the presentation here. One of the things I think was really good is that we had an opportunity to sit down with Sheriff's Office representatives and go over this while we were going through their surveillance use policy. We're going to touch up on some of those key issues there throughout this presentation. But first I wanted to start off just a little bit with a technology primer about what biometric or facial recognition technology is, because I feel that some members of the public or committee, just to kind of help them, understand what it is we're talking about when we say facial recognition. So basically, just to give you a rough idea, facial recognition technology is just one of several biometric technologies that are out there. So some other examples are iris retina scans, palm prints, voice prints, individual gait recognition, DNA, and some others.
And I apologize. I'm sure I could have looked it up, but it was late. Wrist veins?
Yes, I know that's not something that's widely known, but there is a unique pattern in wrist veins similar to you would see on a fingerprint or a face print.
And that's a visible pattern that somebody can see just by taking a photograph of the wrist vein, or does it require something more technical than that?
No, it takes an algorithm to actually analyze that as well. So similar to facial recognition that looks at a face print, there's also an algorithm that crunches the numbers on the wrist vein patterns, the distance between veins, the length, and the width as well to determine what that unique pattern would be.
But it's not like there's an intrusive process. I mean, it's a picture of the wrist vein that goes through the algorithm and the system.
Correct. It's not an invasive process.
All right. Live and learn. Thank you.
No problem. Well, that's part of the primer here, to learn a little bit about biometric technology. Anyways, just some examples there. There are 80 nodes on the human face that are analyzed as part of facial recognition. So those would be notes, for example, the distance between the eye sockets, the distance over the brow of the nose, the distance across the temples of the nose and the forehead, and the distance across the lips and the mouth. So those are examples of what each of us has as unique features that can be analyzed as far as facial recognition technology when they're actually trying to crunch to develop that face print. The technology has improved over time. It's shown percentage of errors has been halved every 2 years since 1993, but as we'll see, there are still significant problems with false positives. It is still a technology that is in development. It is not mature yet, and so we're going to discuss that here shortly. A couple of the two different methods that we have when we talk about facial recognition in particular are the identification method and the verification method. Now, the identification method, also known as the face in the crowd, that's where facial recognition technology, the cameras can scan and they'll try to identify someone in the crowd that may match an image that they already have in their database. There are significant privacy and civil liberties issues that deal with this particular type of method of recognition. Yes.
Excuse the interruption again. And just to be clear, so I've got a picture of Bob Smith. I've got a crowd with 100 people in it or 100,000 people in it. And the identification method is to say, here's my picture of Bob Smith. I wonder if Bob Smith is anywhere in the stadium with 100,000 people. That's the identification method, yes?
Yes, correct.
All right, then you're going to take us to verification.
Sure. So the verification method, and this is the method that the Sheriff's Office uses at this time, and that's basically when you have a static image and you compare it to a database such as the arrestee mugshot database. So you got one image and you're comparing it to a database of images. You're not scanning an audience that may be legally and constitutionally protected, gathering, protesting. You have someone perhaps that you brought in and you want to determine if they are in, say, an arrestee mugshot database. So that's a one-on-one. It's a small population in a controlled environment, and there tends to be pre-existing conditions where you have a high-quality mugshot that you're comparing it against. Not saying that even in those instances it's a perfect technology, but certainly much better than the identification method, which just scans crowds in the public randomly, or can do that. So anyways, we also want to discuss a little bit about the integration of surveillance cameras in the public square. It continues to bring a lot of privacy concerns to light. There are other areas around the world and even the United States that are experimenting with it. We know internationally in London they have CCTV that's tapped into facial recognition that scans pretty much almost the entire city. Orlando is also considering that right now. So for our parts, I think even domestically in the United States, we are starting to see this technology take hold with that identification method, scanning the crowd for potentially people that may be criminals, but also may just be agitators. And so we want to make sure that we're careful as we, progress as a county with how we take hold of this technology and the restrictions that we put in place of it. So the reason why I bring that up is because Amazon Recognition is one of the latest technologies that we see today. And this particular technology right now has the ability to go out there. It's a technology that can scan audiences. It can be used for the identification method. There's been several use cases where it's been used to verify identity, sentiment analysis, which means they can actually analyze whether someone looks like they're angry in a protest and try to single them out. That can create issues with a protest that is constitutionally protected. Someone can look angry. That doesn't mean they've committed a crime. It can also work on image moderation, which means they can scan and detect weapons or contraband in an audience. They can also do a search index on video archives and filtering as well. So one of the reasons why I say, and this is an actual example that occurred, and I think it's really important not just to talk theoretically about false positives done in kind of a walled-off atmosphere. This was a test conducted by the ACLU. What they did was pretty interesting. So they actually took a database of 25,000 publicly available arrest records. They compared it to images of members of our own Congress. And at a very minimal cost, what they determined is that Recognition, and that's Amazon Recognition spelled with a K, misidentified 28 members of Congress. And unfortunately, there's a distinct bias of people of color as well. And as you see on the chart over there on the right, and this is indicative of facial recognition software right now as we know it, is that you see, although members of Congress, 20% are comprised of people of color, almost 40% of them were the ones that were misidentified during that test. So a significant bias against people of color. There's also a bias against women as well, showing false positives there. That tends to be because of certain, what they think, what we've heard from our research, is that, obstructions can interfere with doing a face print, and if you have makeup or shadowing, that can interfere. If the background, for instance, is dark or light, that can interfere as well. So those types of interferences show a bias towards people of color and women in a way that, although the technology may not have, that might not have been a reason necessarily why it was developed, but that's certainly a consequence and something that we need to pay attention to, whether that's something we implement through our own sheriff's office or something that we implement in other capacities, because we want to make sure that we don't continue that propensity towards an historical bias against people of color or women. So what's the public perception of this? So while we didn't have exact figures on every single biometric, what we did see, at least with facial recognition, is that we saw, the breakdown of some of our racial components here, that while, white people and Hispanic people, or white people had a little bit more of an approval of the use of this type of technology than Hispanic, and even less for African American. So we need to be mindful of that and cognizant as we look at how we implement facial recognition at the county, and then also other uses that that county departments may want to use that in the future. We need to make sure that we understand what this means, and that we're careful when we do that to make sure that we're aware of that false positive rate, the error rates, and then the privacy issues that come along with that. So right now, getting a little bit into the Sheriff's Office use of this technology. Currently, the facial recognition software that they use is produced by Forensic Logic. The network that they have is called the LEAP network. The capacity of the LEAP network is actually quite extensive. The component that the Sheriff's Office is using right now is one part of that. They're using their own RSD mugshot database to compare that to other images. However, the full extent of Forensic Logic and their LEAP network actually goes well beyond that. So if those other features are activated, it can actually extend out to comparing records against crime decks, BOLOs. It can look at ballistic reports. It can look at license plate reader reports and Carfax reports, even down to that level. So right now, those features, from my understanding, what I've been told, have not been turned on. They're just simply using that to compare to their own database of mugshots. But just wanted to give you an idea of the capacity of that network, and certainly some things that we need to be mindful of as we look at this in the future.
And forgive me, I got lost on this piece when I was doing my prep for today. Carfax, for example, which I think provides an indication that there's been an accident involving a car. Am I understanding that?
That's one of the things that Carfax does report on.
I'm trying to figure out who's matching what against what, because if I've got a picture of Bob Smith, who I referenced earlier, I'm pretty sure I'm not matching that against a picture of a 2017 Toyota. So what am I matching against if I'm using the Carfax component of the database? What are we matching against?
Sure. I think with the larger LEAP network is that it doesn't just look at a one-to-one matching between a picture and then one other component within that database, and then so on. It actually looks through the entire network. So maybe it takes a picture of an individual that's in their car, compares that with a license plate reader network, which can compare it with a Carfax report to get just a greater history or profile on an individual.
And the ballistics, for example?
Ballistics, I don't know if I have a really good case to provide for that, a good example,
Okay.
With how that may be used, because I don't know what a full ballistics report may look like. There might be other information within that ballistics report that, again, can be used to create sort of that larger profile.
Can I ask you to help clarify how this works in an off-agenda report? And no rush, to be clear. This is mostly just, I understand that this is a component of the system that is not used by our Sheriff's Department, if I understand that correctly. But I was baffled as I tried to do my homework, thinking, all right, so what are we matching against what? People against people, I get. Okay, here's some people, here's a person. Is this person one of these people? But ballistics, Carfax, so on and so forth. I'm just curious to know, because if I want to understand both the benefits and potential liabilities of the technology, I just kind of like to understand what the larger technological possibilities and uses are.
Sure, understand.
Thank you.
We'll get on that. Okay, this gets a little bit more into the Sheriff's Office use. The excerpts on the right get into a little bit more about what their surveillance use policy contained and from our discussions. But basically, just wanted to say, and I wanted to call this out specifically, was that while the facial recognition software they use can be used to verify the identity of someone, It can't be used as the sole source for identification. They must, according to policy, they must use a second form of identification in order to verify someone's identity. So I just wanted to make sure that that point was clear and how it's currently implemented by our sheriff's office. The second point there is just mentioning a little bit about how it's implemented within the surveillance use policy. I highlighted a few points there just to discuss a little bit that it can't be something that we exclusively rely upon. And if they do, that's something that, certainly that needs to be rediscussed within this committee and so on about any future uses or potential uses of that technology. And as we swing into those future uses, I've talked with the Sheriff's Office representatives as well, and that if there are any changes, if they do want to extend use and use other aspects of that LEAP network that we discussed, that they need to make sure that they resubmit their surveillance use policy, explain what that new use that they would like to do in practice is, and they need to make sure that it goes through the appropriate vetting, both through the Privacy Office, County Council, Labor Relations, the FEOC, and the board, as well as to be posted online for public information as well. So I just want to make sure that that the public and the committee is aware that beyond the current surveillance use policy, if they want to use that for an extended purpose, to use more of the scope of that forensic logic LEAP network, that they have to go through this vetting process first before that's done. And finally, some of the recommendations that I provided them when I was having a conversation with them was to make sure that they understood some of the flaws with the technology itself as it stands today. Certainly there are some benefits to facial recognition, and I think it can be a wonderful asset and a wonderful tool, but we have to make sure that we don't take this as a sole source of identification, because we have seen not only the false positive rate that can be unacceptable, but how it specifically is a bias against communities of color as well as women. The suggested confidence threshold, right now certain technologies have confidence thresholds that say within 80%, which tends to be a standard default for a lot of facial recognition technology, that if it's, if the match from one picture to another picture is close to 80% correct, they'll provide that as a result back as a possible match. 80%, I think, is a threshold that's too low. Recommendation that I would have would be 95% functionality, search functionality. That confidence threshold is something more reasonable.
Thank you, and excuse me, and 80%, is this essentially a match on the 80 nodes that you described at the outset of the presentation?
No, this would actually be when the algorithm itself looks at a picture to try to identify that with the database. It has kind of a confidence threshold that determines, because it's not perfect. So depending on the angle that the picture is taken, the light quality, the background, the fuzziness. So it may come back and say, the technology may say, it's about 70%. We think it's a 70% accurate match, or an 80% or 85% match. So it's not going to be a 100% match in most cases. So with that, what 80% means is that 20% will come back that they know will be errors. That'll come back and that just won't be correct. We want to make sure that we bring that up so that at 95%, that they're only getting back 5% of those matches that are going to be filed. The rest will be filtered out. And so we want to make sure that that filter is high enough so that we reduce that false positive rate.
Thank you.
Sure. And then some of the other recommendations that we provided are some of the updates to the surveillance use policy, as you are familiar with.
And let me just ask, we have in our packets I don't know if Mr. Coelho has been involved in this as well, but at packet page 93, we have the 2.5-page, 3-page surveillance use policy for facial recognition software. Is the document we have reflective of the recommended updates that you offered, or are those not yet embedded? Mr. Coelho, whoever.
I believe what you have is what was presented to the committee in June, and then you asked that it specifically be held pending this later conversation. So I do not believe any revisions have been made to this since June of 2018.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Great, thank you. That's
yeah, that's correct. And I think we wanted to get through this discussion as well before we discuss what changes should actually be included or not.
Great, great.
Sure. And so finally, I wanted to say that when I had a discussion with Under Sheriff Bender is some of the suggested training that we recommend for the officers, and in every surveillance use policy it mentions training. This is no exception. But one of the things that we wanted to make sure that I reinforce with him as well is to discuss the the bias against the bias of false positives and error rates that we see, especially to communities of color and women, the restricted use of this technology to make sure it is only used to match against an arrestee mugshot database and not for the other uses that are available with the LEAP network. Then as well as to reinforce the requirement that this cannot be used as a sole source to verify identity. There must be a second form to verify identity in order to proceed. So those are the recommendations that I provided, and so far it's been, we've received a good response from that, but we want to make sure that we follow through on that as well. One of the things I wanted to bring out here was something that Supervisor Chavez had mentioned during one of our discussions, and that was the retention period for the facial recognition results that are received. And the surveillance policy right now that the Sheriff's Office has for their software is that it's a 180-day retention period for the results for that. And that's basically to make sure that as they're proceeding through an investigation, as perhaps eyewitnesses may come forward over time, that they are able to retain those results and have enough time to be able to go back and search through that to see if they can verify someone's identity. So once that 180-day period is up, they're supposed to remove those images from their database so that they don't have obsolete data. And also as people age, that can actually have an incorrect match as well. So I just wanted to bring that forward because Supervisor had mentioned that point in particular. One of the other aspects that we talked about in the review, the larger detailed document, was some of the pros and cons of facial recognition technology. So there are some good parts that this type of technology can have for us as a community. So some of those are for law enforcement, both the accountability of our law enforcement officers as well as individuals that they interact with. So it tends to promote civil behavior when when people know that the camera's on and it's recording their activities. Also,
is that the twin cousin of chill, political, and free speech?
Well, we also have the other side of it, right? The cons. So you're right. That's
sorry, couldn't resist. Go right ahead.
Yep, that's why we kind of have the interesting look up to pros and cons there in that slide. So, anyways, the additional method of identification, and then of course you mentioned it briefly earlier about having a stadium event that may scan audiences for people that may have been banned from events. Also for our critical infrastructure support. There's still some issues with this because certainly you might be at an event and somebody may be wrongly identified as being a criminal or on a banned list. So there are still some issues with this that have to be considered, but there are definitely some benefits to this as well. Also with drones that can help out specifically on, I want to be specific here, with missing person searches and hostage incidents. So in those cases, facial recognition can certainly help out to identify a hostage, to identify an assailant in those situations. Then, of course, with missing persons, especially elderly and children, that it could certainly help out with if you integrate that type of technology going forward. So on the other side of this spectrum here, that we have to make sure we balance that with, the cons of it are that there can be an erosion of public trust if this is used either erroneously, if it is used against policy that we have put forward, or if it's used in such a way that it falsely identifies people as being criminals when they are not. The expansion of the scope of surveillance systems, we want to make sure, again, like with the LEAP network as an example, that it's used for a very specific reason right now, and that any expanded use would have to be vetted through our vetting here with Privacy Council and the committees and board as well as the public. And also we want to make sure that we're open and that we disclose that to the public, about issues with historical racial bias, and that we try to have checks and balances in place to prevent that as much as we can. And as you mentioned, it can chill political and free speech. We want to make sure that people can peacefully protest. They can gather in public places without fear or without burden that they may be surveilled or tagged as a troublemaker and have law enforcement or others interact with them in a way that's not appropriate. Finally, a couple other areas with witnesses and privacy and civil liberties issues. I think a lot of the problems that we're starting to see and that have cropped up from previous uses of surveillance technology, specifically facial recognition, have shown that the technology, while it's definitely gained speed and definitely evolved, it is still certainly not mature, and that we are seeing errors that affect people in their day-to-day lives. And so for our part, we want to make sure that we understand that here at the county and how we use that technology for our purposes, and make sure that we're using it for the pro side of that spectrum instead of the cons, and that the benefits outweigh the costs. So that kind of wraps up a lot of the discussion that we had here, both about the technology and about how the Sheriff's Office uses that. One of the points that you kind of brought up earlier that I just wanted to mention here is that that technology is not integrated with body-worn cameras in particular. And one of the things that I mentioned to the sheriff's office, and this goes for any department in how they deploy surveillance technology, is if they ever want to integrate that, if they ever want to use that with other software analytical tools or in new ways that are not discussed in their surveillance use policy, that they must resubmit that for review for privacy, legal, FGOC, and board. So I just want to kind of put that out there.
Excuse the interruption.
Yes.
Mr. Coelho, is that your understanding as well?
Yes, to the extent they're going to use it in a different manner, different purpose, different location, yes.
Yeah, and I'm trying to underscore that that's not just a professional opinion, it's an opinion of our county council as well. So thank you.
Sure, and I believe that is backed up by our surveillance technology and community safety ordinance as well. So I think what that does by having the ordinance in place and by actually committing to that in practice is that'll help keep the public informed and hopefully make sure that we don't erode that public trust and perhaps even bolster the public's perception of what we do at the county and how we try to serve our constituents. So with that, if there are any questions, I am here to answer them.
Sure. I'd like to ask that you go back to the pros and cons page, just because. And we have the stadium event there that's on the page. And Under Sheriff Binder, I'm going to ask you to come back up, and I'm going to ask you both the same question, and a little unusual here. I'm going to commit to not commenting on your answers, and I'm going to give you both the opportunity to just pass on answering if you would prefer not to. But in terms of the pros and the cons, I want to give you a hypothetical, and I'm just curious, genuinely, about your best professional judgments. So we have the technology. Let's suppose we've got a father who has kidnapped his own son because there's a custody case, and the custody is exclusively with the mother in this instance. And in fact, there may even be a restraining order, stay away order, whatever it's called. And we're very clear that the father is the person who has kidnapped the son. We have a picture of the father, we have a picture of the son. We know that the father is a loyal 49ers fan and has not missed a game in the last 4 years. Is it appropriate to say, let's take a picture of this father and the son, scan the crowd at the next 49ers game, and see if they're there? Because we want to make sure no harm comes to that son, and we want to make sure that if the father has kidnapped, we can apprehend. Is that appropriate? Anybody want to lean in and give us an answer? Of course, it involves taking a look at 100,000 people, but.
Well, I would just say, on behalf of the Sheriff's Office, that we don't have that capability with our current facial recognition system. So it's really a hypothetical that we couldn't do that even if it was a life or death situation.
Mr. Shapiro?
I would say if something like that were done, there would certainly need to be a court order, and it would have to be very specific. But I would also warn about the slippery slope effect, that if it's provided in this case, we have to make sure that it's done in a restricted way, and that doesn't open the door for it to be used for other measures that may not be as dire as a kidnapped child.
Well, thank you both. As I say, I was curious what your best professional judgments were. The one other question I have is about where we go from here on the issue of the proposed surveillance use policy. I understood from you, Mr. Shapiro, and you, Mr. Coelho, that the document we have in our materials is the original proposal, and that since that original proposal was forthcoming, you, Mr. Shapiro, have had an opportunity to talk with folks at the Sheriff's Department and make some recommended changes. Is the document scheduled to come back to us at FGOC for review in our next batch, or is that the appropriate?
It's not right now. I think we wanted to get through this meeting first to determine if there are any additional changes that may need to be made to that. The soonest that it could come back to the FGOC would be November 29th.
Well, I think, Supervisor Chavez, if you concur, I think that's the time to bring it back. We've had the conversation. Thank you. I thought it was a helpful and important conversation about the larger set of issues surrounding this particular policy. And I'll have a chance to look at what the revised proposal looks like mindful of all of this. And the one other thing I would say in connection with the surveillance use policy process is that one of the things we hope that would happen is it would force conversations just like this conversation and just like the conversation that the department's been having with your office. And by virtue of those conversations, that we'd end up with better policies in place. So thank you all. That was one of the things that I certainly hoped we'd have. Supervisor Chavez, anything else?
I just wanted to say that one of the things that's kind of alarming about this technology is how personal it gets, how fast for so many. Having said that, I also think that the hypothetical that was given is something interesting for us to think about in terms of best utilization of this kind of technology, because frankly, I was surprised to learn that the window of when we use it is so small. I was particularly thinking about threats of workplace violence, where we have a victim of domestic violence working in large environments, and how we do a better job of protecting those environments. And so I'd really looked at this as nothing but upside, and frankly, this discussion helped me think about it more in a much more measured manner. So thank you, and thanks for the presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Before we wrap this one up, we have 3 cards. One is from Doug Muirhead. Mr. Muirhead, to be followed by Valerie Driscoll. And then I have a card that has no name, and if somebody just neglected to put their name down, they can come on up and tell us who they are if they like. Yes, Mr. Muirhead.
Thank you. I neglected to identify myself earlier. My name is Doug Muirhead. I'm a resident of Morgan Hill. I want to thank the committee for putting this item on the agenda. We are only able to have this conversation today because this committee championed the creation of the surveillance use ordinance. Then the sheriff fully complied, and then I was surprised. I do want to thank staff for the readable white paper reviewing facial recognition technology. But I feel they missed the essence of my written comment back in June, which was the need to have reference standards as the technology matures and/or to have independent verification. In the executive briefing, staff reports that the percentage of errors has been halved every 2 years since 1993, to which I ask, what is the percent today? Staff notes that the particular software used by the sheriff is Criminal Justice Information Services compliant, which is a meaningless citation to me. And staff recommends a confidence threshold of 95% for search functionality, to which I ask, compared against what? Now, you might ask why we need scientific validity of forensic methods. So let's review this new facial recognition magic through the historical lens of arson science. It was only in 1985, with the creation of a National Professional Association and the introduction of controlled experiments, that we began to learn that what was once regarded as truth was myth, and what was once accepted as science was superstition. I am told you can find dozens of reversals of arson convictions where folklore was misrepresented as expert opinion in the National Registry of Exonerations. So going forward, let us not risk convicting people falsely in our rush to embrace new technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments. And we have a card from Valerie Driscoll. Ms. Driscoll?
Speaking in alignment with all of these topics, another problem is because you have so many child custody case issues and no safety in housing. And then the other problem is no regulation, no reduced rent, no rent control. It's a real problem for disabled people like me, because the costs are too high, as the Social Security officer, Mr. Villacourt, told me just today. And the problem with this is that there's just no regulation of any kind. These people can do whatever they want to do. They have their problems with their families. They take it out on people who have to come and live in their homes. There's no place that's safe. And the other thing is that they really need to, and I believe I need to see Mayor Liccardo about this, because they're chasing the paper, as to why the services don't get down to people in the housing and why there's no safe housing anywhere. And then they start mixing people up as criminals and then accusing them falsely when you're trapped in somebody's household, and they abuse you unnecessarily, which I just had to speak to a senior defense attorney about to present to the court. And the district attorney was trying to threaten me when I was living in independent living housing situation, and not allowing me to give my fair hearing testimony about how I was abused, accusing me falsely that I given false information, which I did not. And then this senior attorney, I didn't know I had access to, because we don't have any money, right? no money for us, no justice. I went in and I yelled at the top of my lungs to have people come down and talk to me because of the injustices. They falsely incarcerate individuals because they're claiming they should take medication. They don't determine who they are when it's for sleep, for their own well-being. The people who need well-being don't get any. They're just trashed in with everybody else as if they're criminals. They're taken down and then they're booked in. They have to wipe it off the record because that's what they've done. And then they proceed to starve you in there with their food and abuse you. And you vomit and you're starving and you're trapped in there. And I need to file against this. And then they keep you in too long so it goes beyond the statute of limitations. And then what is implied here is a momentum agency, a bad case manager who doesn't do their job. All of these problems, healthcare included, there are no protections for us. 353 people died. They committed suicide because of it. These people don't care.
Thank
It's
you.
their self-interest.
I have one more card. It is does not have a name on it. I just want to make sure I'm not overlooking anyone else who wanted to speak to this item. I don't believe we are. Appears not. I'll confirm with clerk. We have no other cards on the item. And we will indicate that we look forward to seeing the revised policy if it's forthcoming at the meeting on the 29th and considering it then. And I have appreciated from County Council and from staff the redlined version so we can quickly and easily discern what the changes are from the prior version. That would be helpful again in this case. Supervisor Chavez, the only other comment I have before I turn to you is I thought the comments and the conversation we've been having about the improvements that have come relatively rapidly over time, but left us with a still imperfect technology. I just want to say, this will seem a little counterintuitive perhaps, but I actually worry that as the technology gets better and better, the risk will get greater and greater that people think that they can rely on the technology as being unflawed in some way. So I just hope that as the technology gets better and better, that we don't let that lull us into a false sense of complacency about the potential shortcomings of the technology. I think that would be an unfortunate outcome of improvements. And Supervisor Chavez, anything else before we adjourn? Thank you all very much. Having these quarterly updates on privacy issues and specifically twice a year to devote the time exclusively to privacy issues has been, I think, very helpful, and appreciate everybody's presence and participation today. Thank you all. Without objection, we are adjourned.